They had her tied to a fence with property written across her dress, so I cut the rope without asking. The dust kicked up by my horse's hooves settled behind me like a dirty cloud as I rode into what the locals called Perdition's Gate. Wasn't much of a town, just a collection of weathered wooden buildings squatting in the desert like tumbleweeds that had given up rolling. The kind of place where decent folk didn't linger and indecent folk felt right at home. My name's Samuel Colt. No relation to the gunmaker, though I've been asked that question more times than I care to count. I was a bounty hunter by trade, tracker by skill, and some might say fool by nature, depending on who you asked. What brought me to this godforsaken place was a telegram from Sheriff Morton down in Bitter Creek, asking me to track down a gang of cattle rustlers who'd been terrorizing ranchers from here to the Mexican border. The sun was hanging low like a brass coin someone had tossed against the sky, and the heat was still something fierce. I guided my mare, Salvation, toward what passed for the town's main street, looking for a saloon where I could wet my whistle and maybe gather some information about the Brennan gang, the very same rustlers I'd been hired to bring in. That's when I saw her. She was tied to a fence post outside what looked like a trading post, her wrists bound with thick rope, her ankles hobbled. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just the ropes, it was the word painted in crude black letters across the front of her pale yellow dress: property. She couldn't have been more than 20, with dark hair that had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in, and now hung in tangles around her face. Her dress was torn in places, and there was dirt smudged on her cheek, but her eyes, Lord, her eyes held a fire that all the rope in Texas couldn't extinguish. I pulled Salvation to a halt and took in the scene. There were maybe a dozen men lounging around the trading post's porch, some whittling, others spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. They had the look of hired guns, the kind of men who'd sell their own mothers for the right price. And standing in the middle of them, holding court like some kind of twisted king, was a man I recognized from wanted posters, Jake Brennan himself. 6 feet of mean packed into a frame that looked like it had been carved from old leather and bad intentions. He had a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, courtesy of a knife fight in Tucson if the stories were true. His eyes were the color of dirty water, and when he smiled, which he was doing now, it was like watching a snake bare its fangs. Well, well, Brennan called out as he noticed me sitting there on my horse. "Looks like we got ourselves a visitor, boys. You lost, stranger." I touched the brim of my hat politely, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to draw iron and start shooting. "Just passing through," I said, keeping my voice level. "Hot day for traveling." "That it is," Brennan agreed, his smile never wavering. "Course, some folks don't get to travel at all." He gestured toward the girl tied to the fence post. "Take little Miss Isabella here. She's been with us for, must be going on 3 days now. Ain't you, darlin'?" The girl Isabella lifted her chin and stared at him with such hatred that I'm surprised it didn't burn a hole right through his skull. "Go to hell, Jake Brennan," she said, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent that made the words sound almost musical despite the venom behind them. Brennan laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a cliff. "Now, that ain't no way for merchandise to talk to its owner." He turned back to me. "See, this little wildcat here thought she could testify against me in court, thought she could tell some judge about how we conducted our business. So we're making sure she understands her place in the natural order of things." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. "What's her crime?" I asked. "Crime?" Brennan spat. "Hell, stranger, she ain't committed no crime. She's just property that got uppity and forgot its place. We're teaching her some manners before we sell her south of the border. Ain't that right, Isabel?" One of Brennan's men, a weaselly-looking fellow with gold teeth, laughed. "She's got spirit, I'll give her that. Should fetch a good price." That's when I made my decision. Maybe it was the way Isabel's eyes flashed with defiance even though she was bound hand and foot. Maybe it was the casual way these animals were talking about selling a human being like she was a head of cattle. Or maybe it was just that I'd seen enough evil in my 30-odd years on this earth to know when it was time to take a stand. I swung down from Salvation's saddle, moving slow and easy, not wanting to spook anyone into drawing their guns before I was ready. "Hot day like this," I said conversationally. "Seems to me everyone deserves a drink of water." I walked toward Isabella, pulling my canteen from my belt. Brennan's men stirred uneasily, hands drifting toward their weapons, but Brennan held up a hand to stop them. "That's mighty Christian of you, stranger," he said, though his eyes had gone cold. "But I don't recall asking for your help with my property." I knelt down beside Isabella and offered her the canteen. She looked at me with those dark eyes, and I could see the question there. "Who are you? Are you friend or foe?" I gave her the slightest nod, hoping she'd understand. "Name's Sam," I said quietly as she drank. "Trust me." She handed the canteen back without a word, but I caught the tiny nod she gave me in return. That's when I drew my knife and cut the rope, binding her wrists in one quick motion. The reaction was immediate. Brennan's men scrambled for their guns, chairs toppling, boots scuffing on the wooden porch. But I was already moving, pulling Isabella to her feet and shielding her with my body as I drew my Colt .45. "Nobody has to die here today," I announced, though I had my doubts about that statement even as the words left my mouth. Brennan's laugh was uglier this time. "You got some stones, stranger. I'll give you that. But you just made the biggest mistake of your very short life." He gestured to his men. "Kill him, but try not to damage the girl too much. She's still worth money." What happened next was a blur of gunfire and chaos. I put my first bullet in the gold-toothed man who'd laughed about Isabella fetching a good price. He went down clutching his shoulder, his gun spinning away into the dirt. Isabella, God bless her, had the presence of mind to dive behind the water trough instead of standing there like a statue. Brennan's men were fast, but they made the mistake that most hired guns make. They relied on intimidation more than accuracy. Their shots went wide, splintering the fence posts and sending up geysers of dirt. My shots didn't. I put down 2 more of them before diving behind the water trough myself, bullets whining over my head like angry hornets. Isabella was pressed against the rough wood, her face pale but determined. "Can you ride?" I asked her during a lull in the shooting. "Better than most men," she replied, and despite everything, I believed her. "When I give the word, run for my horse. Her name's Salvation, and she's trained not to spook. Can you handle a gun?" Isabella's smile was sharp as a blade. "Give me one and find out." I handed her my spare pistol, a .38 I kept in my boot. "Try not to shoot me," I said. "I make no promises about the others." Brennan was shouting orders to his remaining men, trying to flank us from both sides. There were still maybe 8 of them left, which meant the odds weren't exactly in our favor. But I'd faced worse odds before, and I had something they didn't, a reason to fight that went beyond money. "Now," I shouted, and we broke cover together. What followed was the kind of running gunfight that would be told and retold in saloons for years to come, assuming anyone lived to tell it. Isabella ran like a deer toward Salvation while I covered her retreat, my Colt spitting fire. She moved with the grace of someone who'd grown up on horseback, and when she reached my mare she was in the saddle almost before I could blink. I put down another of Brennan's men as I backed toward the horse, but one of them got lucky and put a bullet through my left shoulder. The impact spun me around, and I stumbled, pain exploding through my arm like liquid fire. That's when Isabella showed me what she was made of. She wheeled Salvation around and rode straight into the thick of the fight, the .38 blazing in her hand. She scattered Brennan's men like bowling pins, giving me the chance I needed to reach the horse. I hauled myself up behind her, my shoulders screaming in protest, and she spurred Salvation into a gallop that would have done a cavalry charge proud. We thundered out of Perdition's Gate with bullets singing our farewell song, Brennan's curses following us like smoke. We rode hard for the better part of an hour before Isabella finally slowed Salvation to a walk. We were in rocky country now, with plenty of places to hide if Brennan decided to follow, which, knowing his reputation, he probably would. "You're bleeding," Isabella said, glancing back at me. "I'll live," I replied, though my shoulder felt like someone was poking it with a red-hot iron. "Question is, will you? Brennan's not the type to let something like this slide." She guided Salvation toward a small stream that wound between the rocks, dismounting with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. "Let me look at that wound," she said. "I told you I'll be fine. And I told you I could ride better than most men," she replied, pulling bandages from Salvation's saddlebags. "That doesn't mean I'm going to let my rescuer bleed to death from stubbornness." As she cleaned and dressed my wound with the skill of someone who'd done it before, I studied her face in the fading light. She was beautiful, no doubt about that, but there was something else there, a strength that went bone deep, the kind you only found in people who'd been tested by fire and refused to break. "So," I said as she worked, "mind telling me how you ended up tied to that fence post with property painted on your dress?" Her hand stilled for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was quiet. "My father owns a ranch about 50 miles south of here, the Tres Coronas. Brennan and his men have been rustling our cattle for months, but we could never prove it. When they hit us last week, I saw them, I could identify them. So you went to the law." "I tried to, but Brennan has Sheriff Martinez in his pocket. When I wouldn't be bought off or scared off, they decided to make me disappear." She finished tying off the bandage and sat back on her heels. "They killed my father when they took me." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd seen a lot of evil in my time, but something about the matter-of-fact way she said it, the quiet pain in her voice, made my blood run cold. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Don't be sorry," she replied, her dark eyes meeting mine. "Help me make them pay." We made camp in a hidden canyon about 10 miles from the stream, where a small spring provided fresh water and the rocky walls would hide our fire. As we ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack, I found myself studying Isabella in the firelight. She'd washed the dirt from her face and done something with her hair, and the transformation was remarkable. But it was more than just her beauty that caught my attention. It was the way she carried herself,
the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her very bones. "You're not what I expected," I said finally. "What did you expect?" "Most folks who've been through what you've been through, they'd be broken. Crying, maybe, or so scared they couldn't think straight." Isabella stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the women in our family, how they fought beside their men against the Apache, how they held the ranch when the men were away fighting in the war. She said we were forged from steel and starlight, too tough to break and too bright to dim." She looked up at me. "I guess we'll find out if she was right." "I already know she was," I said. We took turns keeping watch that night, and when dawn broke over the desert, we were already planning our next move. Brennan would be looking for us, no doubt about that, but he'd expect us to run. He wouldn't expect us to circle back and hit him where it hurt. "Tell me about your father's ranch," I said as we saddled Salvation. "How many men did Brennan have with him when they hit you?" "Maybe 15 or 20, but not all of them stayed in Perdition's Gate. Some of them are probably at our line camp up in the hills, watching the stolen cattle." "How many head?" "Close to 500, maybe more. Represents most of our breeding stock." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the pain underneath. "My father spent 20 years building that herd." An idea was beginning to form in my mind. Dangerous, but with a chance of working if we were smart about it. "What if I told you we could get your cattle back and make Brennan pay for what he did, all in one move?" Isabella's eyes lit up like stars. "I'd say you better start talking." The plan was simple in concept, though the execution would be anything but easy. We'd hit the line camp where Brennan's men were holding the stolen cattle, scatter the herd, and drive them back toward Tres Coronas. In the confusion, we'd make sure word got back to Brennan about where to find us. When he came looking for revenge, we'd be ready. "It's going to be dangerous," I warned her as we rode toward the hills. "These aren't nice men we're dealing with." "Neither are we," she replied, and the steel in her voice made me believe it. The line camp was exactly where Isabella said it would be, tucked into a valley between two red mesas where the grass grew thick and green from a hidden spring. They had the cattle bunched in a natural corral formed by rock walls, with only one narrow entrance that would be easy to guard. We spent the better part of the day watching the camp, counting men and studying their routines. There were 6 of them, which was more than I'd hoped for, but fewer than it could have been. They were confident, lazy even, the kind of overconfidence that came from thinking you were dealing with helpless victims instead of people who might fight back. As the sun began to set, we made our move. Isabella circled around to the back of the valley while I approached from the front, moving like a ghost through the brush and rocks. The plan was for her to stampede the cattle while I dealt with the guards, but as any soldier will tell you, no plan survives contact with the enemy. I was maybe 50 yards from the camp when one of Brennan's men spotted me. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but my bullet cut him off mid-word. That's when all hell broke loose. The other guards came boiling out of their makeshift shelters like wasps from a kicked nest, guns blazing. I dropped behind a boulder as bullets chipped stone around me, sending up clouds of dust and flying chips that stung like hornets. That's when I heard it, the thunder of hooves, as 500 head of cattle suddenly decided they'd had enough of being penned up. Isabella had done her part, and now the stolen herd was streaming out of the valley like a brown river, carrying everything in their path with them. 2 of Brennan's men got caught in the stampede. I watched them disappear under a sea of hooves and horns, and I can't say I felt much sympathy. The other 3 tried to make a stand, but it's hard to aim straight when the ground is shaking under your feet and cattle are streaming past on both sides. I worked my way closer, using the chaos as cover, and picked them off one by one. When the dust finally settled, the valley was empty except for me, Isabella, and a whole lot of trampled earth. "Well," Isabella said as she rode up, grinning like a schoolgirl who'd just pulled off the best prank in the history of pranks. "That was fun." "Fun?" I stared at her. "Lady, you've got a strange idea of entertainment. My grandmother always said life was meant to be lived, not endured," she replied. "Besides, did you see the look on their faces when 500 head of angry beef came charging through their camp? Despite everything, I found myself laughing. You're completely loco, you know that? So my father always said." The smile faded from her face. "Come on. We need to get these cattle moving before Brennan figures out what happened." Driving 500 head of cattle with just 2 people was like trying to hold back the ocean with a bucket, but somehow we managed it. Isabella knew the country like the back of her hand, and she could read cattle the way some folks read books. When a group started to split off, she was there to turn them back. When they wanted to stop and graze, she kept them moving with a combination of shouts, whistles, and what I swear sounded like actual conversation. We drove them through the night and into the next day, stopping only to rest the horses and grab a few hours of sleep. By the time the sun was setting again, we could see the buildings of Tres Coronas sprawling across a valley that looked like something out of a painting. It was a beautiful place, with white adobe walls and red tile roofs, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. But as we drew closer, I could see the signs of the recent attack: bullet holes in the walls, a barn that had been partially burned, and an air of abandonment that made my heart sink. There, Isabella said, pointing to a hill overlooking the ranch house. That's where we'll make our stand. The hill was perfect for defense, steep sides, good fields of fire, and water from a spring that bubbled up near the top. We drove the cattle into the valley below, and then took up positions among the rocks. We didn't have long to wait. Brennan came with what was left of his gang, maybe a dozen men riding hard and looking for blood. They spread out around the base of the hill, like wolves circling a campfire, but they made the mistake of assuming we were just going to sit there and wait for them to come to us. "You up there," Brennan shouted. "I got a proposition for you." "I'm listening," I called back, though I was already moving to a new position. "You give me back my property, both the cattle and the girl, and maybe I'll make your death quick and easy." "Counter offer," I replied. "You and your boys ride out of here right now, and maybe I won't put bullets in all of you." Brennan's laugh echoed off the rocks. "You got balls, stranger, I'll give you that, but you're outnumbered, and we got all the time in the world." What he didn't know was that Isabella had spent the afternoon preparing a few surprises. While I'd been watching the approaches to our position, she'd been busy with the ranch hand's old dynamite supply, rigging charges at strategic points around the hill. When Brennan's men started their charge, she lit the first fuse. The explosion turned the night into day and sent rocks the size of houses tumbling down the hillside. 3 of Brennan's men disappeared under the avalanche, and the rest scattered like quail. "What the hell was that?" Brennan screamed. "That," Isabella called out sweetly, "was my way of saying no to your proposition." The battle that followed was like something out of a dime novel, except it was real, and the bullets flying past my head weren't made of paper and ink. Brennan's men tried to rush us twice more, and both times Isabella's carefully placed charges sent them running for cover. But we couldn't keep it up forever. We were running low on ammunition, and Brennan still had men to spare. Sooner or later, he was going to get lucky, or we were going to make a mistake. That's when I heard the sound of hoofbeats coming fast from the direction of Bitter Creek. A lot of hoofbeats. Sheriff Morton came over the ridge like the cavalry in a Wild West show, leading a posse of 20 armed men. Behind them came more riders, ranchers from the area who'd lost cattle to Brennan's gang and were more than ready to settle the score. The sight of 40 armed men charging down on them was enough to break what was left of Brennan's nerve. Half his men threw down their guns and put up their hands. The other half tried to run, but they didn't get far. Brennan himself made a last desperate play, spurring his horse up the hill toward our position with his gun blazing. I rose up from behind the rocks to meet him, my Colt steady in my hand. "This ends here, Brennan," I said. "Like hell it does," he snarled, and fired. The bullet tugged at my hat, but my shot was true. Brennan toppled from his saddle and rolled down the hillside like a broken doll, coming to rest at the bottom with his arms spread wide and his eyes staring up at the stars. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, it was over. The Brennan gang was finished. The stolen cattle were back where they belonged, and justice had been served with interest. "Well, Sam," Isabella said, as we watched Sheriff Morton and his men round up the survivors, "I guess this is where we part ways." I looked at her standing there in the moonlight, still wearing that yellow dress with property painted across it, though now it was torn and dirty and splattered with gunpowder. She'd never looked more beautiful. "Does it have to be?" I asked. She tilted her head to one side, studying me with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. "I don't know. That depends." "On what?" "On whether you're the kind of man who can settle down and help a woman run a cattle ranch, or if you're going to get restless and ride off into the sunset looking for the next adventure." I thought about it for a long moment, looking out over the valley where 500 head of cattle grazed peacefully under the stars. I thought about Isabella and her strength, her courage, the way she'd face down armed men without flinching. I thought about my life on the trail, always moving, always alone. "Well," I said finally, "I suppose every cowboy has to hang up his guns sometime." Isabella smiled, and it was like watching the sun come up after the longest night of the year. "In that case, Mr. Sam Colt, no relation to the gunmaker, I think you and I are going to get along just fine." 6 months later, we were married in the little church in Bitter Creek, with Sheriff Morton giving away the bride and half the territory in attendance. The wedding dress Isabella wore was white as fresh snow, with no words painted on it except the ones written in our hearts. They say that love can conquer all, and maybe that's true, but I know for certain that when you find someone worth fighting for, someone worth bleeding for, someone worth changing your whole life for, well, that's when you realize that some ropes are meant to be cut, some words are meant to be erased, and some properties are meant to be free. And that's the truth. As sure as my name is Samuel Colt, and as sure as the woman I love once told a gang of outlaws to go to hell while tied to a fence post with property written across her dress. The end.